Today, 2nd November, we are approaching one month since the start of the crisis in the Middle East, following the events when Hamas attacked southern Israel on the 7th of October. And I have to say straightforwardly that it is becoming increasingly clear to me that the accumulated errors of US and Israeli policy are becoming increasingly apparent and increasingly evident in the way in which this crisis is playing out. Now, there continues to be intense fighting in Gaza. And yesterday, I discussed the fact that I'm getting contradictory messages from various people as to the progress of the Israeli operation. But today, I think we are starting to see clearer evidence that Israel is indeed taking losses. The Israeli government, the Israeli military themselves, admitted yesterday that over the course of the fighting on Tuesday and Wednesday, 15 Israeli soldiers had been killed. There's now increasing numbers of pictures provided by Hamas of what do appear to be Israeli armored vehicles which have been destroyed. There's a somewhat alarmed article in the Daily Telegraph, which fiercely supports Israel in Britain, about the fact that Hamas has been able to convert commercial drones and is using them to drop grenades on Israeli positions. And I've heard about reports which also appear to show Israeli soldiers caught in the open, attacked by Hamas forces in various forms, and Israel, these Israeli soldiers being killed or wounded in the fighting. And I can't obviously provide detailed corroboration of all of this. And I am not, of course, in any way disputing that Israel is also inflicting casualties upon Hamas. But of course, the thing that always needs to be remembered is that Hamas can absorb casualties. It has the organization and the willpower to absorb casualties. And Hamas is fighting a war where the political clock is working in its favor, and the same is not true of Israel. Meanwhile, bombing continues. Hamas continues to launch its rockets, but they don't seem to be having a huge amount of effect in terms of the damage that they cause. But the bombing that Israel does in Gaza undoubtedly is having a devastating effect and indisputably is killing thousands of civilians. Now, following my program yesterday, many people pushed back that on some of the things I was saying. They pointed out correctly that the parallel I was making between civilian casualties inflicted in Gaza by the Israelis and civilian casualties inflicted by the Russians in Ukraine was erroneous in one respect, in that of the 9,900 civilian casualties that have happened in Ukraine, in other words, civilians killed in Ukraine, as reported by the United Nations. Some of these, perhaps most of these, have been the result of Ukrainian military action as opposed to Russian. And that, by the way, is absolutely true. And if I gave the impression yesterday that all of these casualties were the result of Russian military action, that is obviously wrong, and I apologize. By the way, and for the record, over the last day or so, there has been a very heavy Ukrainian artillery and missile strikes upon Donetsk city, again as reported by the Russians. And no doubt these missile and shelling of Donetsk are inflicting casualties, and there's no doubt that civilians are affected by them. But anyway, the point I was making, and I think it is a valid point, is that the deaths in Gaza are on a completely different scale from the deaths in numbers of deaths in Ukraine. And that is the message that is being communicated around the world. And again, people push back on my observation that about the numbers of civilian casualties in Gaza. I mentioned that we're getting figures from the Ministry of Health in Gaza, which, as I pointed out, is under control of Hamas. Several people pointed out that the Ministry of Health gives names for the people it says have been killed. Well, I don't find that a compelling fact in itself. Names, after all, can be made up. I'm not saying by any means, by the way, that they have been. But the point to make is that there is no doubt that thousands of people are dying in Gaza. And these numbers are being corroborated now by UN agencies. And that, again, of course, is the point I was making. You may be skeptical about information that comes from the Gaza Ministry of Health, but UN agencies carry considerable political and international weight. They presumably have information which they're getting directly from the ground, and in any event, they are corroborating these numbers. And for the record, I've had other reports from people who have been observing the situation in Gaza very closely indeed. Some of whom, by the way, and I'm talking about military, ex-military people, some of whom, by the way, are far from sympathetic to Hamas, but they suspect that the true number of people who are being killed in Gaza is actually much greater than the numbers that the Gaza Ministry of Health is providing. So I just want to say that. But the point is that the effect of this around the world, and it is the actual diplomatic effect of this around the world that we're now starting to see, is from a Western point of view, from the perspective of the United States, from Israel's own perspective, it is catastrophic. And there's already been articles, there are now increasing numbers of articles about this. There's a powerful article on this very question by Anatol Lieven, which has appeared in The Guardian. And Anatol Lieven makes this point. I'm going to read from this article extensively. He says, if Moscow and Beijing are content with a purely diplomatic and public relations victory, they do not need to do anything further at all. US virtual silence in the face of Israel's indiscriminate bombardment of Gaza is doing it for them. Yet again, the United States has used its UN Security Council veto to defend Israel as the solitary opponent both of all the other United Nations Security Council members and a large majority of the General Assembly. As Western and some US diplomats have remarked off the record, unfaltering US support for Israel has shredded the Biden administration's strategy of competing with China for influence in the global south. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Western reaction to it, the charge has been made across most of the non-Western world, including by US partners like India, that the West has one standard for white victims and a much lower one for everyone else. The Biden administration and many European governments have now in effect confirmed this. Witness, in a widely circulated clip, the US National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby choking back crocodile tears over Russian bombardment of civilians in Ukraine, then justifying Israeli collateral damage in Gaza, although according to UN figures, Israel has already killed almost as many Palestinian civilians in 2 weeks as Russia has killed Ukrainian civilians in 20 months. The last, of course, is exactly the point I made yesterday. Equally striking has been the refusal of the Biden administration to do anything to help the 500 to 600 Palestinian American US citizens trapped in Gaza. If anyone wants evidence to argue that in the eyes of Washington, some US citizens are more equal than others, then they need look no further than this. So that's Anatol Lieven, person who has been very strong in support of US policy in Ukraine, who can in no sense be considered overall a critic of the United States, who on the contrary, he's many articles in Responsible Statecraft, which can at times be critical of Western policy, nonetheless goes out of his way to show that he is a loyal member of the Western team. But even he can see that a diplomatic disaster, a diplomatic catastrophe is shaping up. And we can already see it. Israel's relations with Turkey have apparently entirely collapsed. There are apparently no Israeli diplomats in Turkey. There's not been an announcement of a formal break in diplomatic relations. There is still apparently a functioning Turkish embassy in Tel Aviv. But to all intents and purposes, Israel's relationship with Turkey, a country with which its relationship has been long-standing, it's been one of Israel's oldest partners in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Anyway, that relationship has all but collapsed. And yesterday, we got a cascade of news that other countries are now reconsidering their relations with Israel. Jordan has recalled its ambassador. Bolivia has broken off diplomatic relations. Chile and Colombia have recalled their ambassadors from Israel also. And the decision by the Colombian government to do that is also, to be clear, a diplomatic blow. Israel historically has had good relations with Latin American countries, and Colombia has been one of its most long-standing friends. Colombia, of course, is also a key ally of the United States in Latin America. In fact, one could almost say that of all the countries in Latin America, no country has been as reliable an ally of the United States as Colombia has been. Colombia has now recalled its ambassador from Israel. And the UN continues to work. There was a powerful speech at the UN General Assembly from Russia's formidable ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia. He has spoken out strongly against Western double standards. He is making exactly the point that that Anatol Lieven has been making in this very same article. And of course, there is every potential for the situation to get worse. Now, again, I've received some people, they've written to me complaining about the fact that I have not spoken, I haven't described what Israel is doing in Gaza as genocide. Let me make it very clear that one of the reasons I do that is because I dislike intensely the use of that word, genocide, way in which that concept of genocide has been massively abused, in my opinion, in recent years to pursue what I consider to be catastrophically ill-judged, badly thought out, inappropriate prosecutions, and to act against various people around the world. There have been all kinds of, I thought, misconceived prosecutions based on that. And I want to make it very clear that I don't agree with them and I don't like that phrase. And for that reason, I avoid that word. And for that very same reason, I avoid using it. But we've now had actions in Gaza and statements from Israeli officials, which, to put it mildly, are extremely unwise and ill-conceived, and which might, if there is, for example, a referral by the General Assembly to the International Criminal Court, well, I can see how they might quite easily result in a prosecution against Israel on precisely that basis. Firstly, we've had this massive bombing of Gaza, and we come back to Anatol Lieven's statement, indiscriminate bombing of Gaza. Those are his words, not mine. Indiscriminate bombing. We've had the UN agencies, as he correctly said, saying that as many people have been killed in Gaza as a result of that bombing. In 2 weeks, civilians have been killed in Gaza in 2 weeks as a result of that indiscriminate bombing, as have been killed, civilians have been killed in Ukraine in 20 months of fighting there. Well, that already is bad enough. When we talk about indiscriminate bombing, that can in and of itself amount to a war crime. But consider the language that some Israeli officials have been using. Consider, for example, the recent speech of Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, in which he spoke about Amalek, a person who in the Bible is referenced in the Bible. I forget which particular passage in the Old Testament. I've seen, however, others refer to that passage. I believe it's in Samuel. But anyway, the point about Amalek is that he and his kin should be completely smitten and destroyed. We've seen Prime Minister Netanyahu write about a struggle between the sons of darkness and the sons of light. Apparently that was said in a tweet that he then deleted. And we've seen even more comments, even more unwise, reckless, inflammatory comments from other Israeli officials. And if there is a referral to the International Criminal Court, which there might be, there's every reason to think that the General Assembly, for example, might decide to make a referral to the International Criminal Court. Now, of course, many will say correctly that the General Assembly has no right to make a referral for war crime investigation and prosecution to the International Criminal Court. That is not set out in the Rome Statute. But of course, the Western powers, the United States, Britain, have shot themselves in the foot in relation to that kind of legal argument, valid though it might have been just a few months ago. Because though there's a strong, arguable legal case for saying that referrals by the General Assembly to the International Criminal Court have no legal basis, the United States and Britain have supported a decision by the International Criminal Court itself to indict President Putin on, in my opinion, an utterly unfounded charge, despite the fact that Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute, and there's been no referral at all of Russia and of Putin to the International Criminal Court, either by the UN Security Council or by the General Assembly. So let's assume that the General Assembly does make a referral. How can Britain and the United States convincingly argue against it? And if that referral to the International Criminal Court is accepted, well, let's say prosecutors, investigators there get to work. What do they see? Indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, and they're going to combine that with the language that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been using and other Israeli officials have been using. And I can say that, in my opinion, all of this, one can certainly make a very strong case, meets all the legal requirements to bring charges, genocide charges, if that is the decision that is made by the International Criminal Court. And of course, there could be other pieces of evidence that could be put together as well. Evidence about the intention to displace the entire population of Gaza, to get them to go to Egypt, to other places. There is now a big accumulation of evidence that the Israelis did indeed have that intention, and that they were supported in that intention by the United States and Britain. This still has a big potential to turn out into a debacle, and perhaps, in fact, all the evidence that that debacle is shaping out is already there. And we're starting to see that in the United States, within the administration, on President Biden's own part and on the part of his advisors, the penny has started to drop. We saw a couple of days ago, I discussed at length a couple of days ago, how the discussion, the readout, the White House's readout of the discussion by the conversation, the telephone conversation between President Biden and President al-Sisi showed clear signs of a US retreat. We had words in that readout to the effect that a mass expulsion of people from Gaza had been excluded, that this was no longer on the agenda, that humanitarian aid ought to be allowed into Gaza. Apparently some has been allowed in, but nothing remotely on the scale that it should have been. We see also that we also saw that in that particular readout, the White House made no reference in that readout to Hamas. They didn't even mention Hamas by name. And there were, again, ideas of humanitarian pauses floating around in the readout. Well, we now have a whole series of articles in the US media, one in Politico, one I believe in the New York Times, which are trying to shift the blame for what, as I said, is rapidly becoming a diplomatic debacle onto Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I've, not without cause, putting aside the decision-making, the bombing strikes, the offensive against Gaza, I said that the language that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been using has been all but disastrous. It has been heard around the world, and I've explained how it could be used, potentially, in a prosecution, a war crimes prosecution, in the International Criminal Court, or for all I know, in any new tribunal that is set up to look at what has happened in this conflict. And anyway, we now see more reports about how the administration considers that Prime Minister Netanyahu shouldn't be there for very long, that his political support in Israel is fragile, and that the administration expects him to be in office for a relatively short time. And of course, all of these comments, all these commentaries that are appearing in the US media, they are clearly, in my opinion, signals to people in Israel that the United States, that the government of the United States, that the administration, in other words, wants to see Netanyahu go. They want him to go so that he can be replaced by somebody else, so that the situation can be brought out of control. So all of those ideas that we had at the outset about a military campaign in Gaza, about potential military campaign against Iran, that all of that can be brought to some kind of stop and some kind of diplomatic process can be put back on track. I mean, to me, that is what all of these articles are about. And today, we had from Associated Press confirmation that President Biden himself is now talking about the need for a humanitarian pause. Now, I'm going to read what the Associated Press piece actually says. It says, President Biden said he thought there should be a humanitarian pause in the Israel-Hamas war after his campaign speech Wednesday evening was interrupted by a protester calling for a ceasefire. I think we need a pause, Biden said. The call was a subtle departure for Biden and top White House aides who throughout the Middle East crisis have been steadfast in stating they will not dictate how the Israelis carry out their military operations in respect to the October 7th attack by Hamas. Now, I actually am far from convinced that the last is indeed the case with President Biden, where he says many things, knowing what it is that he actually means and what he doesn't mean is impossible to know with any certainty. His words don't often track his intentions, and I'm not convinced that this is a case when his words do in fact track his intentions. He blurted out this comment, I think we need a pause, in response to a heckler who was demanding a ceasefire, and perhaps he was just responding to the heckler by saying the first thing that came into his head. Or alternatively, and perhaps more plausibly, there is discussion within the administration about the need for a pause which, to be very clear, might very easily evolve into an outright ceasefire. And perhaps that is indeed the direction in which we are starting to go. We're now starting to see how some of the more fervid supporters for this military operation are beginning to become worried. They're beginning to worry that support is starting to falter for what Israel is trying to do in Gaza. We've had Con Coughlin, for example, in the Daily Telegraph saying the West may be too weak for the fight against Hamas. And the subtitle reads, I'm not going to waste time tracking the article itself. It says, the subtitle reads, it took years to eliminate Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has not been eliminated, by the way, just saying. But already many want Israel to accept a ceasefire. And Con Coughlin then goes on to acknowledge that there are now people backing a ceasefire. In Europe, increasing numbers of people backing a ceasefire in Europe, including some European governments, and that there are increasing calls within the Democratic Party, amongst Democratic Party supporters in the United States, supporting a ceasefire as well. Now, how did we get here? how on earth did the United States and Israel find themselves in this situation? Well, without in any way saying that, I agree with what Prime Minister Netanyahu did, I can understand the political pressures he was under. In my opinion, and I say this straightforwardly, I think after the events of the 7th of October, the only correct and proper thing for Prime Minister Netanyahu to have done was resign. The situation, the failure of intelligence and of security in the run-up to that attack was disastrous. If it is true that the eye was taken off Gaza and the troops were redeployed from the border with Gaza to protect settlers in the West Bank who have been encouraged to take action to some extent by officials within the Israeli government, well, that is a massive political failure by the Israeli government. Prime Minister Netanyahu is the head of that government. The correct and proper thing for him to do was to resign, to step down, to allow a new government to be created, one which could have acted in a more measured, perhaps, and more clear way. But Prime Minister Netanyahu is a known quantity. There was never any real prospect that he would resign, that he would respond to the crisis in that way. His instinct inevitably would be to stay in place and to continue to fight for his political existence. After all, that is what he has been doing successfully for the last 2 years or so. That is something the White House should have known and understood. And given that that is so, and knowing the kind of political pressures that Prime Minister Netanyahu would face, both from within his government and from within his supporters, and knowing that made him far more likely than not to launch the kind of operation in Gaza which he has now launched. What on earth was the US doing? What was President Biden doing when he went to Israel and in effect publicly gave Prime Minister Netanyahu a blank check? Well, there we are. Prime Minister Netanyahu is now cashing that check in. He is conducting this military operation in Gaza. He is doing so in ways that make complete sense in terms of his own political prospects in Israel, make complete sense for many people in Israel at this particular time, but which are provoking a general geopolitical debacle, a major political crisis, all of which could have been foreseen, should have been foreseen by the administration when this crisis began. And I can't help but think that the reason we are in the situation that we are in is because some people, some officials in the administration reacted viscerally to this crisis, took the view that Israel not only had to be supported, but that this was the opportunity, this was the moment to go after the supposed octopus, the head of the octopus that was allegedly behind that attack on southern Israel on the 7th October, which of course is Iran. And I use that metaphor of the octopus, not because I place any credence in it. In fact, I consider it a nonsensical one. As I've said many times, I think people grossly underestimate Hamas's own capacity to make its own decisions, its own agency. And US and Israeli officials have admitted that they have actually no evidence that Hamas was informed Iran of what it was about to do. They're only guessing when they say that. But I've actually read somewhere an Israeli official an actual member of the Israeli government, apparently, going forward and talking about the octopus, the Ayatollah regime as this octopus, of which Hamas supposedly is only a tentacle. And I think people in the administration, probably some people in the administration, probably generally think that, and they said to themselves, this is the moment, this is the opportunity we have to resolve this situation in that way once and for all. And they deployed all those warships, they sent the missiles, the fighter jets to the Middle East. They gave every conceivable indication that they were moving towards some kind of, that the whole thing was moving towards some kind of denouement, some kind of attack on Iran. And those comments about the Ayatollah regime being the head of the octopus were made just a day or so ago in Israel, and it suggests that there are still some people who think in that way, even now. So they went along with all of this. They didn't judge the weight of the international reaction. They were completely outplayed diplomatically and politically by the Chinese, by the Russians, by the Iranians. They misunderstood and misjudged reaction in Saudi Arabia and Egypt. They thought that they might be able to get the Egyptians to agree to open their borders so that people from Gaza could actually go into Egypt. They made every conceivable mistake at the beginning. This has been a catastrophic failure of statesmanship at every conceivable level on the part of the United States, or rather, to be more precise, on the part of the administration and of the various European governments who have supported this policy. Now, I don't think from this point on there is any potential good outcome. The administration is now mumbling about the need for a ceasefire. Whether they're going to be able to persuade Prime Minister Netanyahu to agree to that is another matter. The attempts by the administration to encourage people in Israel, and perhaps Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, to arrange for his departure from the Prime Minister's office, are certain to be resisted by Netanyahu himself. And he's already made speeches which, to my mind, are part of his pushback against that. That appalling speech with its references to Amalek, in my opinion, is a straightforward pitch by Netanyahu, first to his hardline supporters, the hardline parties in the coalition that he leads, and which are indispensable parts of that coalition, to stick by him. In that programme with Alistair Crook that Glenn Deason and I did, Alistair Crook explained the eschatological ambitions of these people to set up Israel, in the state of Israel, in the land of Israel, to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, to do all of those things. Well, here we see Prime Minister Netanyahu using their language. And it is clear that he's talking to these people. He says, look, I'm the person you can rely upon to work with you to achieve your objective. If the Americans get their way, if they remove me from the office of Prime Minister, you will not be able to fulfill that religious mission which you have. So this speech was partly a pitch to them. And of course, it is also a pitch to Prime Minister Netanyahu's long-standing allies, both amongst some members of the Republican Party who as evangelical Christians perhaps are open to this kind of eschatological language, though I want to stress, from my own experience, far from all evangelical Christians in the United States are really open to this sort of thing, but also perhaps more particularly to Prime Minister Netanyahu's long-standing neocon allies in the United States, people like Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, who, in my opinion, I'm going to say this straightforwardly, I don't think eschatological beliefs form any part of their worldview, but of course they can seize on this kind of language in order to present to the administration, to argue, to push back against the administration, and say that by trying to leave a Prime Minister Netanyahu out of power, trying to get him to rein in what he is doing, the United States, the administration, President Biden himself, is appeasing the forces of darkness against the forces of light. So, whatever its worldwide impact, which, as I said, is little short of disastrous, in my opinion, and that speech that Prime Minister Netanyahu made, potential evidence as it might be in any war crimes case that might eventually be brought. By the way, I should say that I doubted that such a case would be brought at the start of this conflict, given the trend of opinion, the movement of opinion in the UN, at the Security Council and the General Assembly. I am now less sure about that. But despite those greater calamitous consequences, in its own way, from a narrow political view, Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech was a clever speech. It probably bolstered support for him within Israel, and it probably won support for him from his old political allies, his neocon allies in the United States. So, there we are. The president, the administration, has lost control of this process. My own view is that these mumbling words from President Biden for a ceasefire are going to go unheeded. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu and his officials will continue their military campaign in Gaza. I think that means that the political damage that has already been done is now going to get worse and worse. Either Prime Minister Netanyahu gets his way and the Israeli army wins a quick and clear-cut victory in Gaza, which, to be frank, I still consider unlikely, despite all the advice I've been given by all these military people, which I take very seriously. Let me repeat again. Either that works, in which case Prime Minister Netanyahu's position is secured, but his relationship with President Biden is damaged, probably beyond repair, and the United States' geopolitical position is damaged as well, or it doesn't succeed within the necessary timescale, in which case protests in Israel increase, and there have been protests in Israel already, and there is already very damaging film of riot police in Israel beating protesters. I believe these protesters, in fact, I understand these protesters. I haven't seen this video. I understand these protesters are actually religious Orthodox Jews. But anyway, either the protests in Israel grow, the protests in the United States grow within the parties, within the Democratic Party itself, leading to President Biden's own position being undermined. Support in Europe collapses. A ceasefire is eventually imposed, not by the United States, but it's imposed on the United States and ultimately on Israel itself as a result of the weight of global opinion, in which case, of course, the United States has a geopolitical disaster on its hands. The Biden administration will have suffered the biggest geopolitical defeat the United States has experienced since the fall of Saigon. Well, there we are. That's where we are going. I don't think, as I said, that the president has any real control over this. In fact, the risk is that the worse things get, and I think they will get worse, the more likely it is that the voices within the administration, which is still there, we still want an attack on Iran, will start to come back and grow louder, and they might even start to say that the only way out of the situation, which avoids that geopolitical disaster that I'm talking about, is for the United States also to become directly involved, to launch that attack on Iran, to try to destroy the octopus at its head, to try to achieve regime change in Iran. And to be absolutely clear, that would make the already colossal geopolitical disaster that will come far, far worse. And of course, it could involve the United States in a prolonged conflict with Iran. And here, by the way, Anatol Lieven makes an extremely valid point in his article that I've just quoted from in the Guardian. He makes the point that if there is an attack on Iran, then, and I'm now quoting directly, then Russia at least will do its utmost to arm Iran. For Russia, these are Anatol Lieven's words, for Russia, such a strategy would be irresistible, given US and NATO arming of Ukraine. And attacks by Iranian-backed Shia militias on US troops in Iraq, if they manage to cause significant casualties, could give these hawks a casus belli, and I've already been talking about that. It's interesting to see Anatol Lieven come to the same view. And of course, he goes on to say, Anatol Lieven goes on to say that the Russians are in a strong position to give very considerable military support to the Iranians, which would change dramatically the nature of a conflict. So there we go. I cannot see for the United States any good outcome to this. Even if Prime Minister Netanyahu is successful, Israel is successful in Gaza, it seems to me that the United States will continue to pay a political price. And as for Israel itself, I'm going to say this. Prime Minister Netanyahu has led Israel down a path which, though it makes political sense for him, I'm not convinced that it makes political sense in the long term for Israel. If this process of countries recalling their ambassadors, reducing their diplomatic contacts with Israel continues and even accelerates, then it seems to me that Israel, even if it is victorious in Gaza in the end, could find itself in a weaker and more vulnerable position overall than it might have been in if it had responded to this crisis, the original Hamas attack, in a more measured way. Anyway, those are my views. I understand that there are many people on each side who feel that one should not analyse these events in the way that I have done, should not take the sort of unemotional, perhaps, approach. It seems to me, and I have made this point many times, President Putin made it again recently in his discussion at the Russian Security Council. In understanding crises of this nature, and if you are a leader of a country that finds itself at the center of a crisis, the duty that you have first and foremost is to put your emotions under control, think before you speak, and even more before you act, weigh everything that you're going to do, provide a firm and clear lead, and work towards an outcome that is both achievable and realistic and beneficial to yourself. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in my opinion, is failing that test, despite, I say that, though I acknowledge, as I said, the political pressures upon him. The administration in Washington has failed in that test even more entirely, and for them, to be frank, there are no excuses at all. Anyway, there we are. We will see what goes on. I have come fully round to Alistair Crook's view that this war, this battle, is going to play out, and seeing, as I said, the trend of opinion around the world and in the Middle East, I think he's probably right. In fact, I'm sure he's right, that we're going to see events in the Middle East play out on a scale that we haven't arguably seen since the Arab Revolt of 1916. I think the mood, the sentiment in the Arab world, even amongst Arab governments, increasingly mirrors that. Anyway, there we are. That is one crisis. As if that were not bad enough, we of course have the other crisis, which is the crisis that we've seen in Ukraine. And that crisis, I've already spoken many times about the geopolitical debacle that the West is facing there. And this is even less excusable than the crisis, the debacle, the likely debacle we're likely to see in the Middle East. Because whilst in the Middle East forces exist which are always difficult to control, this conflict in Ukraine, and this bears repeating once more, was completely avoidable. If the United States had worked to implement the Minsk agreement, the Minsk II agreement, which is enshrined in a resolution of the UN Security Council, for which the United States itself voted, if the United States had worked to make sure that Ukraine had worked through the Minsk agreement, if it had also given pledges to Russia that Ukrainian membership of NATO is entirely off the agenda, there would not have been a war in Ukraine. I am completely convinced of that. And one of the reasons I've just bring up that topic is because Nikolai Petrov, Professor Nikolai Petrov, who we have been honored to have as a guest on the Ukraine, on the conflict in Ukraine. He has written a long article which has been published by National Interest. It's been co-written by him and Tom Snyder, and in it he outlines again the dismal, disastrous diplomatic history, the sabotage of the Minsk agreement, the complete bad faith Western governments showed with respect to the Minsk agreement, their intention to, their insistence on their absolute right to invite Ukraine to join NATO. All of these things. He outlines all of that, whilst also calling again for a diplomatic solution to this conflict, and doing so, moreover, with the recognition that now the war for Ukraine is existential, that what is now at stake in Ukraine is not Russian control of Donbass and Crimea anymore. It is the very survival of Ukraine as a state, and if it does survive as a state, as something better than a broken and bleeding rump, denied access to the sea, entirely subject, in effect, to the goodwill of Russia. I have to say again, Professor Petrov has been a consistent voice of sanity throughout this entire crisis in Ukraine for many, many years. I have to say that I read his article thinking again how wise it would have been to have followed the advice that he has given over those many years. And I have to say also that I'm sorry to say this, I believe that the time to follow that advice has probably already passed, but nonetheless, it is good that he reminds us of it. And who knows, perhaps it might still be possible to retrieve something from this debacle. Not that I see any sign that anybody is making any serious effort to do that. But anyway, Professor Petrov talks about this being, and Tom Snyder, I should say, talk about this being now an existential issue for Ukraine. And we've had confirmation of this from no less a person than General Zaluzhny, overall commander of Ukraine's armed forces. He has just given, he has had a massive series of, well, there's an interview with him, there's an article by him, there's a whole discussion with him, which has appeared on The Economist. It's a huge amount of General Zaluzhny that we're seeing in The Economist. And it gives us an astonishing picture of the state of the war. First of all, General Zaluzhny, to all intents and purposes, admits that the great offensive, the Ukrainian offensive that we heard so much about, has failed. It's not going to achieve any of the objectives that it set out. It's not going to break through to the Sea of Azov. It's not going to break the Russian land bridge to Crimea. He denies that there is going to be a breakthrough. And to quote him, these are his words: due to many subjective and objective reasons, the war at the present stage is gradually moving to a positional form, a way out of which, in the historical retrospect, has always been difficult for both the armies, armed forces, and the state as a whole. At the same time, and this is the key words next, the prolongation of a war, as a rule, in most cases, is beneficial to one of the parties to the conflict. In our particular case, it is the Russian Federation, as it gives it the opportunity to reconstitute and build up its military power. Therefore, the issues of understanding the causes of such a situation, finding possible ways out of it, and changing the nature and course of this war in favour of Ukraine are of particular relevance in modern conditions. And he then goes on to talk about a stalemate, that the war is in effect in a stalemate. Can I just say, this is a complicated and elaborate language to admit that the offensive has failed, there has been no breakthrough, and that Ukraine is caught up in a war of attrition. Now, the fact that Ukraine is in a war of attrition is something that Brian Beletic has been saying on the new Atlas ever since basically the war began, that the Russians are seeking to demilitarize Ukraine, to take apart its armed forces. We've been saying it on the Duran. Others, Alex Vashinin has been saying it. Douglas McGregor have been saying it. Lots of others have been saying it. Well, now we have that admission from General Zaluzhny himself. Ukraine is in a war of attrition, and it is losing the war. The prolongation of a war, as a rule, in most cases, is beneficial to one of the parties to the conflict. In our particular case, it is the Russian Federation. The Russians are winning the war. That, in plain English, is what General Zaluzhny is saying. Now, of course, this series of interviews and short articles and all of that, which he's put together in The Economist, all of this takes us back to that interview with The Economist, which he and General Syrskyi, and by the way, President Zelensky as well, gave to The Economist almost exactly a year ago. And this was in anticipation of the great offensive that we have seen this summer. And General Zaluzhny gave a shopping list to The Economist last year. He said that he would get to Crimea. In order for him to get to Crimea, he needed 350 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 155mm howitzers. Well, he didn't get that entire package, but he was given much the bigger part of it. And he then launched his offensive, the one that he spoke about last year to The Economist, and he's now admitting that this offensive has failed, that the war is in stalemate, that there's been no breakthrough, that everything is reduced to positional terms, that Ukraine is in a war of attrition, which the Russians are winning. And of course, Zaluzhny, formerly built up in the West as this Napoleonic figure, this military genius, what is he doing in order to explain his own failure? Well, he's coming up with excuses. His first excuse is that he overestimated the effect of high casualties on the Russians. He said this was his big mistake. He thought that the huge casualties that Ukraine is inflicting on the Russians would cause the Russians to give up. And he said that against any other adversary, this would have happened. But in Russia, life is cheap. The political system is such that the Russians just keep going despite all the casualties that you inflict upon them. I have to say, I found this one of the most infuriating comments that I've seen by any general in any war. I mean, in effect, what Zaluzhny is saying is that the reason I didn't win is because the other side went on fighting. They didn't give up in the way that I expected that they would. And of course, we just take a step back and think about that. Of course, Zaluzhny is assuming that his own inflated figures for Russian casualties are true. And of course, he is ignoring the nature of the adversary that he is fighting. It ought to be well known by now throughout history that Russia is a very difficult adversary to take on in a military struggle. That the Russians fight their wars with extraordinary tenacity and resilience, and that they can always bring together resources into play that potentially will overwhelm any adversary that they are fighting. Zaluzhny, who should have known better, at least pretends to us that he disregarded all of that. So, in effect, he says that he underestimated his adversary, and this is his big mistake. Well, anyway, I'm not going to say more. As I said, I find that so astonishing that I don't feel I can say more. But anyway, he then also hides behind this argument that you see many people make. I believe it started with an article, actually, first made by Simplikis the Thinker about a year ago, that in modern warfare, with all of the complex observation systems that exist today, the satellites, the drones, the surveillance devices, it's impossible to catch the enemy by surprise, and this is what has made it impossible for the Ukrainians to achieve a breakthrough. Now, I'm going to push back against this. I know that this particular theory is fashionable, but I think the basic reason why neither side has been able to make big breakthroughs so far in this war is because neither side has up to this time had the numbers to do that. Throughout history, it's been acknowledged that that in an offensive against strong armies, and barring tactical and strategic genius, a attacking party needs to outnumber the enemy by at least 2 to 3 to 1. And up to this time, over the course of this war, neither side has had that margin of superiority. The only time when a margin of superiority at that level existed was briefly during the short time window that Ukraine had in the summer and autumn of 2022, when Ukraine launched its offensives in Kharkiv region and Kherson region. And the Russians responded to that sensibly by stepping aside, letting those offensives take place, causing the Ukrainians to suffer losses, conserving their forces until they were able to build them up. But anyway, that's what I think. But again, Zaluzhny is hiding behind this theory that, in fact, it's these modern surveillance devices that make a breakthrough impossible. Well, if that is correct, why, in that case, has he been attacking over the last year? How does that make any kind of sense? Surely he should know this. He should have known this. He should have known that offensives in this kind of context make no sense at all. But again, he isn't giving up on the idea of offensives and breakthroughs. What he's basically saying is that he needs more of everything, even more than he said last year. Last year, he wanted 350 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 howitzers, and of course the ammunition that goes with all those howitzers. He wanted all of that in order to achieve the breakthrough. Now he tells us that what he needs is vast fleets of drones, electronic warfare systems, better counter-artillery abilities, more mine and breaching equipment, and he also wants to build up his reserves. He's been sending huge numbers of men to fight on various offensives, but he suddenly discovered the importance of building up reserves. And he says, provided he's given all of that, eventually he might win. But if he's not, then the war of attrition will continue. And logically, at that point, following Zaluzhny's own logic and his own admissions, the Russians are going to win. And in fact, we're getting more evidence that that attrition war is indeed increasingly going Russia's favour. I should say that I do not accept that the war is in any sort of stalemate. On the contrary, there's been a lot more information that the Russians are now making major moves in the Kupiansk area. They've again blown up pontoon bridges over the Oskol river line. They've captured apparently significant chunks of territory. It's absolutely clear now that their primary objective in the Kupiansk area is not even to capture Kupiansk, but to surround the Ukrainian troops there and destroy them. And they're getting ever closer to that particular objective. And in Avdiivka, it's increasingly looking the same. The Russians incidentally claim that over the last 24 hours, they have destroyed 8 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles in the Avdiivka area. And I understand that there is photographic evidence which shows knocked out Bradleys in the Avdiivka area, also knocked out Leopard 2s in the Avdiivka area. We're now seeing more and more evidence that Ukraine is suffering heavy material and manpower losses in the Avdiivka area. And importantly, the Russians are still advancing. And it is increasingly looking as if Ukraine now faces a choice. Either it continues to defend Avdiivka, in which case there's a serious risk that its troops there will be surrounded, or it pulls them back, in which case, going back to that article by Michael Clark in the London Times that I discussed from a few days ago, in which case there's a real possibility that the entire Ukrainian defense system in southern and eastern Donbass will start to collapse. And in fact, there's already some evidence that Ukrainian defenses in southern Donbass are already cracking. Yesterday, there was reports that south of Avdiivka, the Russians have finally managed to make significant advances in Marinka, more significant advances, isolating further the few remaining Ukrainian positions that Ukraine still holds in Marinka. And this is partly because the Ukrainians, in order to try to stem the ongoing collapse in Avdiivka, are having to redeploy troops from Marinka. So this war of attrition that Zaluzhny is talking about, it is not in stalemate at all. It is not in a positional phase, as he suggests, but it is a war of attrition, and as he admits, the Russians are winning it. So, what does he propose that Ukraine do? Well, I'm going to say straightforwardly that I think we are probably in the last days of General Zaluzhny commanding the Ukrainian military. To me, all of these commentaries in The Economist have something of a valedictory character. We see Zaluzhny trying to explain away the failure of the offensive that he commanded and just a failure, despite the fact that he was provided with nearly all the equipment that he asked for when he was in contact with, when he gave his previous interview to The Economist last year. So we see that this is what he's basically doing. He's defending his reputation. He says that given the necessary tools, he can still win. He needs air power, he needs drones, he needs more electronic warfare, more counter-battery abilities, more mine-breaching technologies. He talks about, need to bring up the war to a completely new technological level. Unclear what technologies exactly he has in mind that haven't been used already. But as I said, it looks to me as if he's preparing his defense of his record for the moment when President Zelensky sacks him. And we saw from that article about Zelensky in Time magazine that Zelensky almost certainly is working towards that point. Now, there is a fairly widespread view in Ukraine that once Zaluzhny is sacked, which it seems to me he probably will be, he will stand for the presidency of Ukraine. And no doubt when he does eventually do that, well, he's got all those commentaries in all those Telegram channels we've been reading over the last year and a half about how his excellent advice to President Zelensky was disregarded, and how he always spoke about the need for Ukraine to conserve its forces and not to go on to rash offensives. Well, he's got that all there, even though he never acted on that advice, that same advice which he has supposedly been giving. On the contrary, he always did whatever it was that Zelensky and the Western powers told him to do. So no doubt he will be playing on all of that. But what happens if he is elected president of Ukraine? What is his plan in that case? Well, I don't see much sign that he has one. He's talked in the past of Ukraine going onto the defensive. Maybe that would have been a good idea if it had been the policy that had been followed in the summer of 2022. Or perhaps it would still have been possible to follow that policy, the defensive policy, after the Kharkiv or Kherson counteroffensives. Or perhaps even as late as August of this year, when it became clear that Ukraine's offensive was not succeeding. He should have gone on the defensive then. That was what George Beebe and Jim Webb pointed out and argued for in that excellent article they wrote for Newsweek back in August. At that point, there was still a significant amount of equipment, a significant number of troops available. Ukraine would have had better options to go on the defensive then. But on the defensive now, with no fortified lines of significance built up, with the Ukrainian army bled white in the battles of Bakhmut and in the offensive, with the average age of Ukrainian soldiers, as admitted by The Economist, being 43, with complaints, as we read in that Time magazine article, that even if the West supplied Ukraine with all the weapons Ukraine wanted, there's some Ukrainian officials who worry that there just isn't the manpower anymore to use those weapons effectively. Well, it is too late for this. And one thing that remains entirely absent from all of these discussions, from what General Zaluzhny is talking about, what Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's now alienated and antagonistic spin doctor who's now calling Zelensky a dictator and using other similar rude words about him, and who, by the way, I strongly suspect, if Zaluzhny does make a presidential run, Arestovich will be there to some extent to guide him. Well, what I don't see from any of these people is a political plan to bring the war to an end. And absent such a political plan, we're going to get more attrition, and attrition which Zaluzhny himself admits Ukraine simply cannot win. Now, there is not going to be deliverance from the United States. The electronic warfare systems, our counter-artillery systems, mine-breaching equipment, jet fighters, all of those things that Zaluzhny is talking about, they're going to not appear in anything like the quantities and numbers that he thinks. Apparently, the tide of opinion in Congress in the United States is hardening amongst Republicans against further military aid for Ukraine. We now have a situation, apparently, when House Republicans say that they will not authorize any kind of further funding package unless aid for Ukraine is separated from aid from Israel, and the administration, for its part, doubting that in that case aid for Ukraine will get through Congress at all, is instead insisting that the two need, the aid for Israel and the aid for Ukraine, must be treated together as a package. I don't know what's going to happen eventually. I'm not going to try and predict the labyrinthine politics of the US Congress. What I will say is that when we're faced with that kind of situation, it's becoming absolutely clear that support for the continued funding and arming for Ukraine in the United States is starting to drain away. So Zaluzhny is not going to get even a fraction of what he's asking for. But of a political plan, he gives no sign. Instead, as I said, he seems mostly focused on making excuses for his own failure. It is another debacle, perhaps not as serious as the one that is looming in the Middle East, but a debacle on a humongous scale nonetheless. Well, that is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all of our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.